some of our contingent in Australia, and two I can think of immediately who would be interested in this, but who can't join us because of time. And of course, we've got members across the globe, so hopefully they'll be able to join us at a future time. We will be having Victoria talk to us about the book sales. So let me just remind you to start with that there is a link on the site. We'll go through that at the end, but there is a link. Go through the club, you'll get a discount. And Victoria has very generously agreed that some proceeds are coming the club's way. So this is about supporting the club. Without further ado, we'll get on with the substance of the meeting, and it's about Victoria's book, Remarkable Journeys. So this is a fantastic book. If you haven't read it, I hope by the end of this you'll be very much wanting to. So let me start with an endorsement from a novelist, Ted Wilson, a Vietnam War veteran, who said, for example, that Victoria has woven together voices with historical context to create the Bayeux tapestry of the Second World War. How good is that? And she's from the grandchild generation, so the freshness of her look is a vital part of the book. And if anything, she's taught us that we should love these extraordinary men and women even more than we do, even you, Colin Bell. And so this is Victoria's second book. She'll also talk a little bit about the first one, which was 6 Weeks of Blenheim Summer, which was written by her grandfather. It's a memoir from him. And both of these books started with finding her father's manuscript, a memoir, completely unexpectedly, while she was clearing out possessions and what have you. So, and that book's already had 2 print runs. This book is slightly different. It's more testimony from people, and it's not just about the RAF, it's also about other people who participated in the Second World War. So you'll find Merchant Navy, Household Cavalry, Home Guard, and so on. And particularly poignant one from a Holocaust survivor. So Victoria, over to you, I think.
Thank you very much, Di, for your kind words, and thank you all for joining today. In doing so, as Di said, supporting the RAF Club, and proceeds from the sale of every book bought following this podcast will be going to the club. Now I'm going to read you an excerpt, first of all, from Colin Bell's chapter, Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell. I'm going to go straight into it. Skimming rooftops over the heavily defended German capital of Berlin, Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell flew his de Havilland Mosquito as low as possible during the most precarious of all the bombing raids in which he took part towards the end of the Second World War. This was a nighttime flight, but it was not dark, and certainly not peaceful, for the sky was brightly lit and chaotic with anti-aircraft fire, blasting at him from every angle, above, below, starboard, port, every inch of his aircraft exposed and vulnerable. Every minute of survival during such a flight, so typical of thousands undertaken by bomber crews throughout the whole of the Second World War, was a gift, and not for a second could Colin, as the pilot, or his navigator, afford to lose concentration. If they flinched for even a moment, they could pay the greatest price. On this occasion, the likelihood of survival was further diminished, for not only were they under attack from bombs and bullets, but radar too. For over half an hour, their Mosquito was vigorously pursued by a German Me-262 fighter aircraft, which, at any moment, he said, could have turned them into confetti. It was imperative that the fighter should not obtain clear visual identification of the Mosquito either, and to avoid this, Colin had to keep putting his aircraft into a power dive, changing direction to move out of range. This succeeded in the short term, but it was only a matter of minutes before the night fighter, directed by his ground controller, made renewed contact, again through the radar. Repeatedly, Colin had to take evasive action to shake off the ME-262, but repeatedly he came back, appearing dangerously close to the Mosquito's tail. This cat-and-mouse activity continued until Colin decided to go down to rooftop level, flying as fast as he could, causing the German fighter to use up a disproportionate amount of fuel. Now I shall just hand you over to Colin.
Hello. Well, thank you for having read that, Victoria. Nice to be with you, and it's rather flattering a description of everything that I did, but all true. Now, as a World War veteran, I've read many excellent books about World War II, and as Dai has already mentioned, mainly they speak of one individual, and Basil Embry's Wingless Victory was just such one. Well, it was an excellent book, but what to my mind distinguishes Victoria's book from most is that she's brought together experiences and interviews with a number of living veterans. This is no book written by some ghostwriter. It is written by a very talented authoress. That's you, Victoria. It's titled Remarkable Journeys. Well, to my mind, it could well have been called Outstanding Experiences. It's a book that, in my view, ranks equally with Lord Ashcroft's book, Heroes of the Air, which I suppose in some respects is similar, except again, it concentrates just one, Heroes of the Air War, whereas Victoria has brought together interviews with heroes from all services and walks of life. You've been invited to buy the book, and I would certainly underwrite that suggestion. But I would ask you, please, when you buy it, to skip chapter 7, an excerpt from which Victoria's just read you. I was never a hero. I was a survivor, as would Doug, my navigator. Just consider this. On arrival at our Pathfinder squadron, we were invited by our flight commander to sign up not just for one tour of duty, but 2 tours of duty. And Doug acidly replied, I'm looking for a victory medal, not a posthumous VC, and I supported him. And perhaps that's why I'm here. Anyway, congratulations on your book, Victoria. It's an honor to be asked to say something about it and about you. I now pass back to Dai.
Well done, Colin. Thank you very much for that. And for those of you that are not aware, Colin's remarkable journey reaches 100 years at the beginning of March. So just another 6 weeks to go for 100 not out, Colin. I'm sure we're all looking forward to that. And hopefully we'll have a miracle cure that will allow us all to meet up and toast your health properly. Before we go on, I hand back to Victoria. Can I just let you know that the questions and answers, there is a Q&A facility there. It's slightly easier to manage if you use the chat facility that most of you will see. And you can put those in at any time, and we will clearly sort those out at the end. But please feel free to use that. If questions come to you as we go along, then that's good. Thanks very much, and over to you, Victoria.
Thank you again, and thank you, Colin, for those kind words. Yes, I'm going to read some more excerpts very, very soon, but I just wanted to say that actually writing this book has indeed been a truly remarkable journey for me too, and a very unexpected journey. but one for which I'm very thankful. Remarkable Journeys of the Second World War is a collection of short stories. They can, of course, be read consecutively or one by one over as long a period as you want to. And it is for everyone who yearns for an appreciation of the Second World War, beyond knowledge of facts and figures. Each chapter, I promise you, is a previously untold memory of the Second World War, which shines a bright light on these 6 dark years, illuminating the courage, actions, and sentiments of thousands, millions whose wartime experiences changed the course of history. When I read the chapters again, I think how extraordinary they would be if they were fiction, but they are not fiction, they are fact. They illustrate the reality of war, and nothing can help us better understand the Second World War than personal testimonies such as these. I have been warmly welcomed into the homes of each of the veterans. There have been tears, sometimes mine, and laughs, but above all, a searing honesty that has opened my eyes and deepened my understanding. But now, today, the stories, I believe, actually have a wider purpose, a purpose I never dreamt that they would need when I started writing them up, because these are memories that tell of remarkable courage and strength in adversity. The action, sacrifice, and courage of this generation saved us then, and I truly believe we can and must draw strength from them again in the unusual and difficult experiences of the present time. I just want to read you something quickly now from Elizabeth Halls, who wrote up the foreword. Elizabeth has become a good friend of mine, and I got to know her as an author because she too wrote up a World War II memoir based on her father's story. She wrote, "This book does not concentrate on the battles, the maneuvers, the aircraft, the ships and the tanks, and the progress of the conflict. Instead, it looks at individual lives and lets them be the lens through which we gain an understanding, not principally of the war itself or how it was won, but what it was like to live it. And in the process, as we can see the individual spirit, courage, and resilience of each person's tale set against the sadness and struggle from which they rose, we realize something profound about why the winning happened against the odds." We are also invited, as we read, to accompany Victoria on her own remarkable journey as she interviews her subjects. Unusually, for a series of memoirs, Victoria herself appears in the pages in relation to the veterans and their unfolding stories. We are sometimes there with her in the room, and she becomes for us an everyman of our own age, as she reaches back to try and understand what it was like for them to live their own life in wartime. In this, I hope the book is a journey for all of us. And now, on to the remarkable journeys. We've just heard from our friend Colin Bell, one of the 5 RAF veterans I spoke to for the book. 2 were navigators on Lancasters, but each story completely different. The next is John Ottewell's memory. His story opens the book with a description of what he did as a teenager when taking to the sky was a dream to him. So he told me how he jumped off the roof of his parents' shed to find out what it was like to be in the air. Ouch! But how his story develops. Called Navigation by the Stars, I attempt to describe the tools he used to guide the RAF's mightiest bomber through some of the most precarious of circumstances. For example, he told me about a sextant, which had a bubble-like spirit level and a little clockwork mechanism which gave an average of 6 shots, resulting in the altitude appearing on the counter, and a hook on the top that hung in a dome. From the way John described it, it was clearly an ingenious and essential piece of kit, but not at all easy to use, and I wasn't surprised when he said that sometimes he felt that he was only able to navigate and find his way at all by the stars. How much easier it must have been when the sky was clear. John said that even though they did have good maps, often they simply did not know with any degree of accuracy where anywhere was, and sometimes, he told me with a twinkle in his eye, the instruction was to fly somewhere with not even the starting point well mapped. Tricky. Not something we can appreciate today, with so many ridiculously easy to use satellite navigation kits. And there is much more in this chapter too, including his memory of being part of Operation Manna when Bomber Command dropped essential food parcels to the Dutch, many of whom were left starving towards the end of the war because the Germans had cut off their food supplies. The other Lancaster navigator was Noble Frankland, whose memories include being part of the D-Day landings, without understanding the liberation of France had actually begun before he returned. Dr. Franklin described other flights to me, during which he thought his time was up, but today I've chosen to read you an excerpt of his D-Day memory. I had to work like a maniac with very little time to do anything because our target was to bomb a radar station near Saint-Pierre-du-Mont in Calvados in northern France. Our orders were that our bombs were to hit the target precisely at a precise time, and we didn't have very long. Usually, we were a disciplined, quiet, conscientious bunch, but on this occasion, the boys were particularly chatty, which I found irritating because, as a navigator, I was having to do some quite complex calculations, so I told them off. But they continued to be more excitable than usual, pointing out to me the ships they could see in the channel with balloons flying from them. I thought it was a commando raid. Anyway, we kept going and made it to the radar station, duly flew around, dropped our bombs and turned to fly home. And then I heard the boys shouting excitedly again, urging me to look down. And then I saw the first soldiers going ashore and even more ships with balloons. But I still didn't know really what was going on. Now, forgive me, current audience, if we just move away from RAF memories for a moment, but don't worry, there are more, because I'm asking you now to cast your minds eastwards to Burma and Pat Rourke, who was born and brought up here and was just 18 years old when her precious homeland began to be bombed by the Japanese in December 1941. Pat's is a very colourful chapter because she loved Burma so much and described to me the beautiful trees, the birds and the sunsets, but she was so saddened by the enemy onslaught and described it thus. Excuse me. All around, there were the widening gaps in a society falling apart at the seams. There was a stunned pause after the air raids on Rangoon, while the inhabitants of Burma came face to face with the ghastly suspicion that their country was actually about to be overrun by the Japanese. Many of the Indians began to flee. The Japanese battle cry, "Asians for the Asians," seemed to have been received with cynicism. It was the beginning, Pat told me, of the past being destroyed, the future looming, as impenetrable as an ocean must be to a submarine whose instruments have all failed. She learned, during the awfulness of seeing Burma weakened at the hands of the Japanese, to put a lid on regret, disappointment, longing, anticipation. In fact, any emotion at all that would weaken her ability to cope. And this is the chapter you need to read too, if you are interested in the Enigma Code. After being forced to leave her country with her family, just before it became occupied, she went to India, and where Pat found work in a special liaison unit, helping with the transcription process of code from Bletchley Park. Now, away from Burma, and to Douglas Huke, the eldest of all the veterans I spoke to. Douglas died almost a year ago, just short of his 103rd birthday. His is the Merchant Navy, the Red Duster chapter. He served throughout the whole of the war as a wine waiter and a bathroom steward. He spoke to me of joyful memories, including the opportunity he had to buy wonderful tea in Sri Lanka, and of seeing the Northern Lights whilst he was on duty in Scapa Flow. However, this is possibly the chilliest chapter in the book too, only cold showers on board, and he gave me some anecdotes of very unusual cargo. For these, you must read the book. However, I think I would be doing Dougie and all of those who perished that day if I did not mention the Lancastria, the troop ship that sank on the 17th of June 1940 off the coast of Saint-Nazaire in France, laden with British Expeditionary Force troops and French civilians wanting to escape their country, which was no longer theirs. With tears in his eyes, Dougie told me, "It was a terrible sight. All the oil tanks caught fire, and the oil in the sea was set alight, and all people could do was jump into the blazing water." Another ship, the Orford, picked up some of the survivors, people of all ages, maimed and burnt, with arms and legs missing. Winston Churchill had his reasons for ordering that the tragedy of the Lancastria should be kept as secret as possible, principally, almost certainly, for what the knowledge could have done to the morale of those preparing for the next fight, the forthcoming Battle of Britain. However, what a legacy of sadness such secrecy leaves. Hundreds, if not thousands, of families left ignorant as to the demise of their loved ones. I shall shortly read you some poetry, because the next memory is one that has been very hard for the veteran to bear. This chapter belongs to Piers de Bernier Smart, who served in the Queen's Dragoon Guards of the Household Cavalry. Whilst in Italy, during the Battle of Coriano in September 1944, he watched as many of his comrades were forced into an attack after reconnaissance had been done that predicted their downfall. He said, "If ever there was a sheer waste of life, it was that, a typical case of ambitious high command ignoring the more junior levels. We paid the costs in full, in circumstances that I attempted shortly after the event to address in poetry. I found it hard to express my feelings about it in any other way." This is part of the poem he wrote. The colonel knew, the brigadier knew, the general of the division knew. They understood the weighing of the dice, a suicidal venture without hope of tactical advantage, of any kind of gain. The general made the situation plain, but higher wisdom, wedded to the plan, was adamant and ordered the advance. Immediate, at all cost, the die was cast. Over the ridge and down the forward slope, into the outstretched arms of death, the squadrons drove. All costs were paid. I recorded too, in Piers's chapter, a common thread with all those in this book who served on their front line, which was their absolute determination to play their part. He was too young to sign up in the early days of the Second World War. But, not prepared to do nothing, he joined the Air Raid Precautions Unit, against his mother's wishes, when he was just 16, after hearing the following words of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, which he said on the 18th of June 1940. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, This was their finest hour. Now, I will take you to Mady Gerard, the youngest of those who gave me their stories. And this is the Holocaust memory. And this chapter was the hardest to write. Mady left little to my imagination. I had, of course, read about the horrors of the Holocaust before and had seen devastating photographs of emaciated captives. But a day spent with a survivor changed me. The yearning in her eyes for peace that will never come will stay with me. Decades later, I know she still feels the cruelty. But that said, Maisie is an amazingly strong, remarkable woman who has made a remarkable life for herself in the fashion world. However, this is a very, very important chapter because she told me her story absolutely for those who could not. I'm not going to read you what she told me about Auschwitz or Belsen. This is described in the book. Mady survived both. But I will read you the words of the man who liberated her, John Randall, who she fortuitously met up with some 50 years after the end of the war. He wrote, "The attempted annihilation of the Jewish people and the manner of its execution must always remain one of the greatest and most disgraceful crimes in history. The thousands of brilliantly talented people from all aspects of our lives, art, literature, medicine, music, philosophy, and every walk of life is so awful that its magnitude can never be exaggerated. In spite of the horrors, the survivors have a history of extraordinary bravery, a determination to survive, and the indomitable spirit to never give up. This must be an inspiration to all of us." And now, on a slightly cheerier note, I'm going to take you to the fourth of our RAF memories, Bill Carter, whose chapter is described as a musical war, because music was his solace, and he brought comfort to plenty of his comrades with cheery tunes too. To cite just one example, towards the end of the war, he was guarding some Italian prisoners of war at a camp in North Africa. And one evening they suddenly burst into song with what he described as an absolutely wonderful rendition of Verdi's Requiem. But that said, Bill's war was certainly not easy. He was an RAF engineer, and during his war he spent over a year in Madeira, which was a very hot, lonely island in the Middle East, helping build an aerodrome needed by 240 Squadron for their operations in defending the Persian Gulf. Bill talked to me a bit about the work, but mostly about the food and the men he worked with. He described the food as hardtack most of the time, including plenty of turtle, meat, and eggs. He said, "Turtle became a very important part of our diet, not only the animals themselves, but also their eggs. The creatures would come out of the water, up to the beach, venture onto the land for about 100 yards and lay their eggs in clusters of around 50 in sandhills. Each egg was around the size of a table tennis ball, but with soft skins that had to be gently pulled open to get to the food inside. Turtle eggs can't really be compared to a cooked chicken egg because apparently the white will always refuse to set. No matter how long it is cooked, it remains viscous and runny. Pretty unpalatable, unless you were very hungry." And the people too. Bill loved it when engineers and labourers from other countries joined them, discovering that he particularly appreciated the good humour of the Russian and Czechoslovakian workers. Little did Bill Carter know before the war that he would learn to say, "Boy, that is a fine piece of pipe," in so many different languages. Now, I shall mention Wally Newby, who I must confess is the only veteran whose story is in this book that I didn't actually meet. I was given his story by Peter Blackburn, whose memory you will hear in a moment. However, Wally's harrowing story recalls his prisoner of war days, building a railway line in Singapore, the relentless, hard labour, meagre rations, fearful pain and stinging rain. However, it is what I've written at the end that I think is the most poignant. The words sadden me greatly, but perhaps make a book like this even more important. They are written by a close friend of Wally's before he died. He said, "The sad thing about this is that when people like Wally spoke about their deprivation and the hard times they had had, nobody would believe him. So he went into a period of many, many years of saying nothing, because much of the time he had been ridiculed that nobody could have suffered like he did. And it wasn't until many, many years later that the whole truth of the matter came out." And now I shall take you to Fred Hooker, a rear gunner on Halifax's. Fred's chapter is about his prisoner of war journey from being shot down over Germany, arrest, interrogation, captivity, and the long march home. Every stage of this journey for Fred demanded patience, resilience, strength, oodles of good humour, and I think more than any other chapter, but this was a common theme amongst most of them, friendship. It was a comfort hearing his story to hear how loyal and close his comrades became. However, it is the image of Fred still in his Halifax, just before bailing out, that I've chosen to share with you today. We had had the green light from control and were soon on our way, flying over the North Sea. Phil, the pilot, mentioned that he couldn't get the height we should be flying at, which was 19,000 feet. He could only make 18,500 feet. After a small discussion, it was decided to carry on at that height, not go lower. We encountered a small amount of flak heading towards Munster. But alas, the next thing I knew, I was sitting in my turret in fresh air. There was no perspex all around me at all, and my Browning guns were trailing over the rear turret, and ammunition was being pulled from the container following the guns. I can remember disconnecting my oxygen so I could get out of the turret, thinking I would go up front as I had no verbal contact with anyone and no guns. I also remember thinking it felt long since I had heard voices over the intercom. I think I'd also been knocked out by an exploding shell or shells, but the air brought me round. I stepped down into the fuselage, into a mass of flames towards the rear of the aircraft, saw someone go out through the hatch, picked up my parachute that was on fire and threw it back down again. Being without oxygen, I think, was beginning to affect me. I remember seeing Charlie, the flight engineer, coming towards me as I just stood there. He picked up my parachute, put his arms across the flames, clipped the chute on and pushed me out. The last person I saw before my exit was Phil, as white as a sheet, control stick hard in his stomach, and then I was gone. And now, just before I end with a mention for my grandfather, just before I end with a mention for my grandfather, I bring you the Home Guard and Peter Blackburn. This is a special, heartwarming chapter, beginning with Peter as a young boy, pillaging parts of a fallen Junkers 88 whilst he was at Culford School in Suffolk with his friends, and all of them getting a caning, but not regretting that because their adventure was too exciting. The son of a farmer, Peter told me how he was a dab hand with a gun from an early age, so when he left school at 16, he couldn't wait to join the Home Guard, and when he did, the day after his 17th birthday, He was the youngest and keenest member of his unit. However, he did get cold feet, and reality hit him upon joining because we were instructed that no prisoners were to be taken, and we should use a bayonet as we were short of ammunition. I had, by this time, shot many rabbits, but I couldn't have stuck a bayonet even into a bunny, let alone a human being standing in front of me. I'm sure I would have come off second best. Can you imagine that as a 17-year-old farm boy? And now, finally, a mention for my late grandfather, Air Commodore Alistair Panton, who, as Di mentioned earlier, flew Bristol Blenheims during the Battle of France in the summer of 1940. Grandfather later wrote up his memories of this time in a diary he called 6 Weeks of Blenheim Summer. I managed to transcribe this, and it has since been printed in hardback and paperback. It is a story that recounts the sadness of a country losing its way, as well as the unfolding military defeat. During this summer, Grandfather was shot down 4 times and finally taken prisoner. And 5 short stories he wrote about his captivity are contained in Remarkable Journeys of the Second World War. Written under a pseudonym, these are as entertaining as they are informative. However, before a few questions, we're just going to play you a couple of readings from this book, which have been set to music, and you can have the YouTube for all of the readings with all of the music after this. But the first one, I think you will agree, is a very touching, special story. And the second is about the Lancastria, the tragedy we learned about from Douglas Huke. So we're just going to play this, and if you just wait a few seconds and the music will start. Thank you. Here it comes.
13th of June. Whatever next? The next day's flying was memorable for one untoward, unmilitary event. Hallows had put up a small rectangular tent, some 8 feet by 4 feet, for the aircrew to use as a locker room. The only possession of mine in there was a fleecy-lined flying Irving jacket, which one of the navigators had been using as a bed. In mid-afternoon, whilst we were away on a sortie, I was told that the 2 sergeants guarding the camp were taken hugely by surprise because a refugee car suddenly turned off the road and raced across the few yards to the tent, brakes screeching to a halt. A woman and a younger man dragged a moaning, crying girl out of the car and hustled her into the tent, the flaps closing behind them. One of the 2 guards, who had run across shouting in alarm, thrust his head into the tent and stood frozen in shock. As Hallows, alerted by the cries, came running, the poor young guard withdrew from the tent and, paper white, gasped, "Sergeant, she's having a baby on Panton's Irving jacket." Although Hallows admitted freely afterwards that he was fair flummoxed at first and a complete rookie as a midwife, he went quickly into action. When I landed an hour and a half later, I could not understand why men were standing around, grinning up at me in the cockpit. When I switched off, everyone tried at the same time to tell me what had happened. The importune birth had been entirely successful. The baby and its mother were safe in a nearby farm with its father and grandmother. The tent had returned to normal, except for the smell of carbolic. My Irving jacket had been burned, and the poor boy, who had made the discovery, was already nicknamed Doc, because his diagnosis of the girl's complaint had been so quick and accurate. 17th of June. Alistair finds out about the sinking of the Lancastria. On our way to Verdun, we passed over the large airfield at Nantes, which, littered with abandoned equipment, showed every sign of the end of a retreat. We had been looking forward to talking about our earlier comic downing of a Storch, but about half an hour after we had landed, whilst we were refuelling, an RAF intelligence officer sent by Robinson for our reconnaissance report appeared with news which put a stop to any light-heartedness. That morning, at the port of Saint-Nazaire, some 40 miles away, the troop ship Lancastria, crammed with RAF troops, had been bombed and sunk with a large loss of life. We, of course, immediately thought of Hallowes and his party, hoping they had not been on board, but dreading they had. When we saw Robinson that evening, I said to him, "Do you think Hallowes was on Lancastria?" "I expect so. Why?" Robinson looked puzzled, and I then realised he had not, by some quirk of circumstance, heard about the bombing. He was considerably shaken when I told him. Oh my God, he muttered quietly to himself. Amongst the 3,000 RAF lives lost in the attack on Lancastria, and hundreds more civilians, we later found out were Hallowes and all his men. They had been killed simply as a result of staff confusion, which had prevented them being flown home.
Thank you, and I'm very happy if anybody wants to ask any questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Victoria. That was fascinating. I'm going to show you two books now because it's interesting. If you go into the library, you'll see one of these. That's the Chorley's Bomber Command Losses of the Second World War. And this covers the period, this is 1939-1940. So this is the period during which Victoria's grandfather was flying. Here is the comparable volume for Bomber Command losses in 1944.
Yes.
Just put that into context. And in this book is another grandparent, in this case, Bill Martin, Wendy, my wife's grandfather, I think Margaret is on the call, who is in that book but survived a ditching on a raid, the Vesseling raid of June the 21st, 1944, when East Kirkby alone lost 12 Lancasters. And if we put that into context of 30 years ago this weekend, Gulf War I started, we lost 8 Tornadoes, 5 aircrew lost their lives in that part of the campaign, compared with in 2,500 sorties, compared with what went on at that time, just to give you a reminder of the scale of the loss that people were dealing with on every single day. So there are some questions for you, Victoria. First and not last, what inspired you to write the book and how did you go about selecting those people?
Remarkable journeys. Well, I was very fortunate after having had my grandfather's book published to be invited to Project Propeller events, which is an annual gathering of RAF aircrew from World War II. So actually 3 of my stories emanated from meeting veterans at Project Propeller, including Colin, which is wonderful. And actually, I didn't actually deliberately straight away plan to write another book. but people started telling me their stories, and I just felt compelled, and I felt I wanted and I needed to write them down. And then as I did, I started telling other people what I was doing, and actually being introduced by default, really, almost, to all of the other veterans who are in the book. They were almost coincidental introductions, which is wonderful, because it meant that they were naturally people who wanted to tell me their stories. It wasn't really a case of me saying, oh, come on, tell me more, tell me more. These were people that actually just started talking and wanted to talk. And then I just thought, goodness, these are really important, these stories. They really matter. They're hugely fascinating and actually very important. And as I mentioned in the introduction, suddenly they're taking on a whole new meaning now, because, you know, these inspire strength and courage, actually, in a very, very significant way at the moment.
That's interesting. Did it take you a long time to get all that information together, to pull this book together?
Yeah, I've been, well, yes, it's been about 4 years, really, from the first chapter, which I think was John Ottewell, who lives in Bristol. I remember going all the way from my home in Norfolk to Bristol to interview him, and yeah, that was about 4 years ago. So yeah, it's been quite a slog, and I didn't have a publisher straight away, of course, so I was hoping I would do something with it, because as I was being told these stories, I was thinking more and more, as I was being told the stories, that these stories represent, each individual memory represents so many, you know, they're not, these are sort of unique memories to these people, but they are representative of so many who couldn't and didn't write up their stories.
No, that's lovely. Thank you. Somebody, whoever Fingers is, has suggested that Colin, this is a work of fiction, because Colin must have been 2 when he flew over Berlin. It is worth recording that the aircrew of the day were normally very young. There were a whole Lancaster crews that went down with an average age of 21 or less. And I myself was on my first squadron at the age of 12, clearly. A little bit older than Rick P.E. was when he started, but you get the drift. Yeah, these were young people.
They were very young.
You mentioned the fact, and particularly the Italy campaign story, which is very poignant, very moving. That some of the veterans actually found this really hard to talk about, to relive. Did you find it difficult to write in the same way?
Yes, I mean, as I mentioned, I did find the Holocaust chapter particularly difficult. But yes, the Piers de Bernier chapter, it just unfolded something for me that actually, just a terrible, terrible tragedy. It makes the loss so much worse in some way, to be writing about people who've died in circumstances that shouldn't have happened, and if reconnaissance had been done and the outcome of that reconnaissance was ignored deliberately, it is a terrible, terrible thing, and clearly it's a very difficult, been a terrible thing for somebody to watch that happening. A part of this book, I should say, whilst I have, there is some, it's not of me in it, but there is a bit of an examination, for example, in the Piers de Bernier chapter, and each chapter is written up very differently according to the way I was given it. But there is a bit of an examination of the different types of grief, if you like, the different types of grief. So to grieve over someone who's died in really terrible circumstances like that is probably, different, and it started me thinking, did the families of those people ever know that? I don't know. Ever know that their very young children, young sons, died unnecessarily? Really makes me very sad.
Of course, we have the luxury today of decent communications. People went off to war and didn't come back for 5 or 6 years, and there was obviously all that lack of information that must have been terrible for the people involved. I'm always intrigued, though. One of the most difficult things that I did in an operational theatre was be next person down the runway after 2 of my colleagues had died in a flying accident. And yet you look back to those, whether it's fighter command, whether it's bomber command, coastal, day after day after day of seeing their friends go, empty beds in distant huts and whatever, and going back and doing it again. And the courage that took, I still find it difficult to get my head around it. Did you get a sense of that sort of the way people went about just carrying on with daily life from the conversations you've had?
Yes, I did, and it was very much quite simply that, almost, you know, we've got a job to do. I did say that to Piers when he told me what had happened. I said, how could you just carry on? How could you respect your commanders after something like that had happened? And he said, well, we've got a war to win. And actually Colin Bell won't mind me mentioning, he was the same, you know, when we were talked about Bomber Command and what Bomber Command did, and he said we had a war to win, we had to win it. You know, there was a determination by the enemy to be extremely destructive indeed, and it was a war that had to be won. It was something that's very poignant, actually, at the beginning of 6 Weeks of Blenheim Summer in Grandfather's book. It actually opens on the 11th of May 1940, which is the day after the Battle of France began, and he's sitting there waiting for first light with his crew of 3, and they're waiting for first light to take to the sky because he did reconnaissance, so they had to be up at the right time for the photographs. And he said that, you know, we're sitting there waiting, but the day before, when the battle began, you know, the defeat was almost predicted the moment it began, because I think he said, I can't remember the exact number, about 5 out of 10 aircraft didn't return. And, you know, during the Battle of France, and the Blenheim pilots and the ferry battle pilots had very slim, you know, fairly slim chances of coming home safely.
Yeah, it would be interesting if we could superimpose today's communications on the scenario of yesterday and see how the casualty reports might have affected decision making. So there we are. There's a nice question from Peter Brindle, who was interested in knowing how you conducted your interviews. Was it over a period of time, single session? Did you record or did you make notes? How did you do this research?
Well, oh, thank you very much. Well, I've got a little dictaphone, which is a little piece of recording equipment, quite a rudimentary piece of recording equipment. So it would, yeah, but I didn't sort of plan questions or anything in advance. It was very much a case of letting people talk and just letting the stories come out. And then when I let the stories come out, every now and again, something quite exciting or something, well, it would all be interesting, will be fascinating, but there would be something which would trigger me to think, right, that's going to make the opening of my chapter. That's going to start their chapter. There's something unusual and different and grabby about that particular mention. But it was, I mean, I made lots of notes and things as well. I would always write things down. I'm a bit old-fashioned like that. But it was a case of having a dictaphone and then coming back and just listening to it, making notes and piecing a chapter together. And I should just say, making sure everybody, including the family members, because cooperation, obviously, from family members of this very significant generation was extremely important. And I was absolutely determined that nothing was going to be published at all that people hadn't checked and weren't happy with. So I did make a real point of doing that. And sometimes I would, 1 or 2 veterans I went to see 2 or 3 times. Mostly it was one visit because some were quite far away. but just whatever it took really to get the story down in the way that they wanted me to.
Yeah, interesting. And as always, you let people talk, they'll tell you things, and it's very interesting that a lot of that generation didn't really talk about it until quite late in their lives.
No, and that's why I wanted to mention the little bit at the end of the Wally Newbury chapter, which I felt was very poignant and very sad, that actually, you know, yeah, lots of them didn't want to talk, I guess, because they didn't want to dredge up these memories, but actually maybe a lot of the time people tried to talk and were just not listened to because it was too unbelievable.
Yeah, sadly, a lot of people, they do tend to bottle that sort of things up. But I did, on a slightly lighter note, and I did say this to you the other day, Victoria, when we spoke. Some years ago, I'd suggested to the Lincolnshire Air Gunners that they'd all have had something interesting happen to them during their service, that their families and friends were probably really bored with, but other people wouldn't be.
Yes.
And after the meal, a gentleman came up to me and he said, when you said something interesting, do you mean like when I got shot down over Wiltshire by the Americans?
Yes.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
So, blue on blue, nothing new.
Yes.
So there are there's a question from Rick about another book, which will come back to you. There are a couple of questions for Colin. So Colin, what we will do is we'll keep this open when Victoria has finished. So anybody who does want to grill Colin will be able to do so. The question from Richard about whether the RAF teaches pilots to navigate by the stars, astronav. No, they don't, not anymore, typically because you can't see them anyway.
No.
But the question from Rick was whether you were planning another book, Victoria.
I am planning another book, actually. Yes.
Excellent.
My plan with this one, I'm hoping to actually make it a bit more accessible for children, to do a younger person's version. I was a little bit shocked and a little bit upset last term when my 11-year-old, who was studying the Second World War in his topic when schools were open, he was studying the Second World War, so I popped it into his book bag, and his teacher looked through it and said, very, very good book, thank you very much, but I think actually it's not suitable for our young audience. And I thought, well, they need to know about these things, so I'm going to condense this and make it smaller. And I've also got a plan possibly to write up some stories of a slightly younger generation, but those who lived through the war as children, quite a lot of evacuee accounts, that sort of thing. And probably, dare I say it, a few more women, a few more remarkable women of the Second World War. I was very glad to get a couple of women into this book. And I suppose essentially on the military side, it was a man's world, really. And one chapter which I didn't quite manage to get because she died shortly before I was due to go and see her was the Air Transport Auxiliary. But never mind. That was Mary Ellis at the club with her beautiful window at the club. But never mind.
It's always worth reminding ourselves that half the people in the world are women.
Absolutely.
I will remember talking to a delightful lady whose husband was a Lancaster pilot. He'd gone and chatted her up because he liked her voice on the radio, and she casually mentioned talking the Dams Raid cruise back down onto the runway at Scampton after that particular event. So these little snippets of history that get lost if people like you don't capture them. So we're very grateful for that.
Well, can I just quickly make a point on that? That if I'm in very early days of planning for that one. So if anybody's got any particular contacts or ideas or thoughts about people for that, perhaps they can get in touch with the club and let you know.
Okay, I'm sure we can do that. And Charlotte's listening, and we'll be on that. So one question, you must be very proud of your grandfather.
Yes.
And you've honoured his memory and his wartime record by producing the book. Did you always intend to write, or was this an accidental discovery?
Well, I did work as a journalist before. I've always been very curious about people, and I've always enjoyed writing. But no, being an author like this, it wasn't something I thought I would actually ever really achieve. I literally came across his memoir. It was a very cathartic time for me, really. My own father had just died, and I found this book of my grandfather's amongst my father's belongings and read it a couple of times and showed it to a publisher. I wasn't expecting really anything much to happen, but he was very interested in it, and then it's begun my journey, and it is something I would like to continue very much.
Yeah, these first-person oral histories and written contributions, their individual memoirs are so important.
Yes.
So much of it has just been turfed out with the rubbish once all the house clearing is done, which is a great shame. And I think it behoves us all to really look at particularly at documents, at records,
Yeah.
before those are consigned elsewhere. So
Yes.
I think you've got one more bit of video to show us, but before you do that, can I just remind people, and you do have the link, that if you are interested in getting a hold of either of these books, then please go through the club website, where you will get the discount code, which I think is a very generous 25% or thereabouts. Reminder that you should be able to go back and have another listen to the recording if you would like to do that. And I should also say thank you very much to Victoria for the time that you've put into this. It is much appreciated. It's a great start to our program. I'm sure you are the first of many. I know we all can't wait to get back to meeting in person, but until then, this is the next best thing. So if you have ideas for topics that you'd like us to air, then please do so. So I will hand back to Victoria, and then when that is done, this will stay open. So those of you that wanted to ask a couple of questions of Colin can do so. But thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you to you all for participating. It's been very interesting. Thanks.
Thank you. And here is a little video which should urge you to buy the book. And thank you very much. And yes, we look forward to coming back to the club. And thank you very much to the club for all you do. Thank you.
Dearest Victoria, here is your beautiful book, Remarkable Journeys of the Second World War, and this is what I said about it. History is made up of billions of shards of experiences, each valuable and essential to make up the larger picture, each tiny yet all important at the same time. In this fascinating and touching book, we hear from survivors of the Second World War in their own words. Their very personal accounts of this huge and terrible period of history show courage, humour, pity and horror, splinters of memory, glittering and vital to our understanding of war and its effects on those who lived through it. It's a completely wonderful book. And to anybody who is looking at this and hasn't read it yet, buy it, give it away, but keep one copy for yourself.
Thank you. I don't know if yeah, that was a sweet message from Joanna Lumley. Anyway, so I think am I handing over to Colin now?
If Colin's happy to speak, Victoria, yes. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful, and as it's been really great that we've been able to start events going again. Look out for the email on wine tasting, which is coming up next. That won't be virtual, at least not the tasting bit.
No.
Colin, are you happy to answer a question or two? I think that'll be a yes. So Colin's now live. Over to you. Can you see the questions, Colin?
I can't see any questions.
Okay. So firstly, somebody suggested you must have been extremely young to have been over Berlin, but that's just because you've obviously had an easy paper round. But
Well,
there's a question from Rick about the Mosquito flight that you did in '98 with Miss Texas, and then there was a question from Simon Bowes about the sort of training that you did, how you were allocated. How did the Air Force decide to send you to the States and somebody else, say, to Africa?
well, I think it was there were just a limited number of people that were told to go across to the States under a scheme arranged by General Arnold of the United States Army Air Corps. Wonderful man. And this invitation came to the Air Ministry before America had even entered the war. So we all had to be formally released from the RAF so that we could go over there nominally as civilians. And I say nominally because, of course, we carried our uniforms in our kit bags. But we were given some very cheap suits, and we were sent across to be trained by United States Army Air Corps. Why were we chosen? I think it's just the roll of the dice. Somebody up in the Air Ministry decided that a certain number of people should go from 11 ITW, where I was up in Scarborough, and I just happened to be one of them. It was as simple as that, really. As to the training we received out in America, well, I could write a book on that, and I'm not going to. But it was very arduous, and they kicked us around unmercifully. And the only satisfaction I had was that the American military kicked their own cadets around even worse than they kicked us. It was very, very good training. It stood me in very good stead when I came back to this country, and I shall be everlastingly grateful to the Americans for what they did for me and for my comrades. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. But Rick was interested in your Mosquito flight, which was 2017, I think, 2018. That was
absolutely. Well, it all arose from the fact that I went across. I was invited by the Air Power Foundation, wonderful group that raised money for war veterans. They invited me to go over to what was known as Skyball, which was an event they have every year to raise money for veterans, disadvantaged veterans. Why they chose me, I've never quite known. Oh, I suppose mainly because they knew from their records that I'd been involved in training American pilots in the States. Anyway, they invited me to go over there, and I met some very, very interesting people. I must have said at some stage that I would very, very much like to fly a Mosquito. And some couple of years later, a wonderful man called Rod Lewis, who had bought a Mosquito from New Zealand and a refurbished Mosquito, extended an invitation to me to go down to San Antonio and have a flight. Well, I jumped at the opportunity. And once again, it tied in with a further visit that I had to Dallas at the at the expense and hospitality of the Air Power Foundation. It was a very emotional experience, and there is a video of it that can be located if you'll go to Google. Anybody that wants to go to Google and fills in Colin Bell RAF, don't forget to put in the RAF, otherwise you'll get the footballer. Much more interesting, but perhaps not what you're looking for. And you'll find that on that Google excerpt relating to me, I don't know where they get all this information from, but they do, you'll be able to locate a film of that marvelous, marvelous flight that I had in a Mosquito. Yeah, I recommend it for the film, that is. Yeah.
That's interesting, Colin. You said it was emotional. Was that was it the sound, the smells? I mean,
Sorry?
clearly it's not you. You were not being shot at, which is a very pleasant thing. But was it the sound of the engines? Was it the smell in the cockpit? What took you back?
Well, I think the noise from the engines, the surge, the pure power surge as we went through and up into the air, it, you know, the atmosphere brought it all back. And there was one lovely little bit that I will, which you won't pick up on the video recording if you choose to go to Google and see it, is what my wonderful pilot Stu, who flew the plane a lot better than I ever flew it, he said to control, you may not believe this, he said, but I got a 98-year-old Mosquito pilot sitting next to me. And there was a pause, and they said, control to pilot. Holy shit. I thought that was rather amusing.
Yes, on which note, I think that's the questions done for you, Colin. So thank you for staying on and doing that, and thank you for those that stayed to listen. And it's a good reminder that we need to get you back to do another chat, maybe when you've got your 3 figures up.
Yeah.
So yeah, stay well. To all those that are still out there, stay well, and I look forward to seeing you all again over a glass of something in the best club in London. So,
yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, Di, because if you hadn't mentioned it, I was going to mention it. The Royal Air Force Club, for those that are privileged to be members, is without doubt, in my opinion, the very, very best club in London. And they've given me tremendous support over the years, and I can't say anything more appreciative of them than simply say it is the best club, staffed by the very, very best people. And as I said before, it's a privilege to be a member. Thank you.
And a privilege to talk to you as always, Colin. So thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we will see you at the next one. And Victoria's still here. Thank you to you for your time.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you, Colin.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.